PoliTact has recently released its Geopolitical Forecast, which has presented some key insights and patterns that we have observed and which would be very important in the coming years. And to validate these patterns and trends, we have been talking to some key scholars and experts in the areas of defense, security and economics in order to get their views on how they see the patterns that we are observing. For our first segment, we have talked to Shahid Javed Burki. He is a renowned economist and foremost authority on the economic affairs of Pakistan. He held senior level positions at the World Bank and is a senior fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Institute as well. He also served as the finance minister of Pakistan in the past. Let us go to Mr. Javed Burki and ask us some of the economic patterns that we have been observing. Welcome, Mr. Burki. The first question I want to ask you is in regards to the most favored nation status that Pakistan has finally given to India. We have been noting, and as you may have observed as well, that in other regions of the world, for example, in Europe and in matters related to the European Union, the nationalistic and security concerns are resurgent and the prospect of economic benefit seems to be receding. A similar pattern is also occurring in the Asia-Pacific region. How do you think that these trends would impact the prospect of economic cooperation in the region of South Asia, particularly as it relates to the India-Pakistan trade affairs?
I think they would be helpful in the sense that both India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, large countries on the South Asian continent, have to recognize that it is important for them to work together to be able to trade with one another in order to make sustained progress. This they have not been able to do because of political reasons. And I've been arguing for a very long time that it is much better to concentrate on economic relationships rather than continue to focus on difficult political problems such as the Kashmir issue, Siachen in the case of India and Pakistan, and sharing of water of the Ganges in the case of Bangladesh and India. Now there is a framework, as you know, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, which was set up in 1985, and that went on to create started two different initiatives. One was called SAPTA, South Asia Preferential Trade Arrangement, and the other is called SAFTA, South Asia Free Trade Area. The second one was started in 2004. Not much progress has been made because of the enormous suspicion these countries have about one another. I have estimated that if there is reasonable free trade flowing between these countries, then both Pakistan and Bangladesh would benefit much more than India will, for the simple reason that economic theory tells us that in any kind of association, the smaller country benefits much more, or the smaller economy benefits much more than the larger economy. So it is in the interest of Pakistan to have a robust trading arrangement with India. And I am delighted that they have agreed to give MFN status to India. They are obliged to give that as a member of WTO. You have to give MFN status to all other members. India gave it to Pakistan in 1995. Pakistan is now saying that it will give that status to India in February of next year, 2012. And in the meantime, they are working on other kinds of issues which should help bringing about greater trade between these two countries. So I am very positive about this development. I think it's good for all countries. It is especially good for Pakistan.
The second question, Mr. Burki, is related to the demographic changes in Pakistan. You have written a lot about this subject, and you recently wrote an article in the Woodrow Wilson Center publication which talks about the changes in demographics in Pakistan since the country came into being in 1947, and the population shifts within the country ever since. Now, one of the recent changes which have caused an impact on the demographics is the floods in Pakistan, which impacted the rural areas, and the other being the war on terror that has especially impacted FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, and has caused them to move to Sindh, particularly to Karachi. How do you think these particular influences are making a change on the economic affairs of Pakistan?
Demographic changes have played a very important part in Pakistan's economic and political history. There have been several large movements. In fact, the largest movement ever in human history took place when Pakistan became an independent state, and 14 million people moved across the new border of India and Pakistan. 8 million people came into Pakistan and 6 million people left Pakistan for India. When Pakistan took its first census in 1951, 25% of its population was made up of refugees. It is the largest movement in human history. Then, as you said, there have been other movements. There was movement of people from North Punjab and Frontier Province to Karachi when Karachi was being built as the capital. Later on, there was movement of Pakhtuns from the tribal areas during the first Afghan war in the 1980s. And there is a movement once again basically into Karachi from the northern areas because of terrorism and security concerns. I wrote another article, I don't know if you saw it. It was called Explosion in Karachi. Now, Karachi has three large ethnic groups that find it very difficult to live with one another. The first one is people who are indigenous to Karachi. These are Sindhis and Balochis. Then there are Muhajirs who came into Pakistan at the time of partition. And then there are Pakhtuns. And they are almost equally divided. And all the troubles that you have in Karachi, the violence, so on and so forth, is because of ethnic rivalries and absence of political institutions where different concerns can be taken care of, and some kind of some ways can be found for these communities to live together. So it has been a challenge for Pakistan to accommodate these movements of people, and for as long as peace does not return to the northern areas of Pakistan, this will continue to happen.
Mr. Burki, how do you see the proposition made by one of the leaders of Pakistan, which belongs to one of the rising political parties, Pakistan, Tehreek-e-Insaf, and its leader Imran Khan has proposed that in times of this economic challenge in Pakistan, one of the ways to cover for the decreasing revenues and cutting of aid from US may be to check the rampant corruption in Pakistan. Do you think it's a wise solution, and what else could be done to increase revenues in Pakistan?
I think that's a very simplistic assessment. Corruption is a major problem, there is no doubt about it. But if Imran is talking about corruption in the sense of people avoiding taxes and people not paying what they need to pay to the government, that's one thing. But if he's talking about corruption that is alleged to have taken place in the case of some senior people in Pakistan, like the president, the prime minister, and so on, that's another thing altogether. If we can focus on improving the tax system and tax collection and increase tax to GDP ratio, at this point it is about 8.6%, which means that collects only 8.6% of its gross domestic product as taxes. It's about twice as much in India. And that's why the government has had to rely so much on external support, because it does not generate domestic resources. So there is that aspect of corruption. People know that tax system is bad because tax officials have always been very corrupt. But then there's big-time corruption also in Pakistan, and that hurts investment. People are not prepared to bring in countries because they money into the country because they know that it's going to be. They don't know where it will go, whose pockets it will line, and so on. Now that's an entirely different issue. So he should be focusing on increasing Pakistan's capacity to generate resources from within. But he should not claim that eliminating corruption is going to solve all problems that Pakistan faces today. I think that is a rather simple statement. I hope he can get some serious economists to work with him in order to give him a somewhat more solid program than he has at this time.
But Mr. Burki, how would one go about doing this? As you know, recently when the government tried to introduce the Reformed General Sales Tax, often known as RGST, the government ran into problem. It was reported by the media that majority of the members of the parliament in Pakistan do not pay taxes, and it seems like if the government was to increase the amount of tax to be paid, it would be on the same people who are already paying taxes. In such a situation, where would the increased revenues come from?
I think you have answered the question yourself by identifying various sectors and various groups of people who have managed to avoid being included in the tax structure. Take agriculture. There is no reason why agriculture income should be exempt from taxation by the federal authorities. That is wrong. You don't eliminate taxes because income comes from a particular source. It doesn't happen in most countries, and it should not happen in the case of Pakistan. This was done in 1973 when Mr. Bhutto came up with the 1973 constitution. And in order to get the support of large landlords, he exempted their incomes from being taxed. That was a big mistake, and I think that has to be remedied. Then there's the question of people avoiding taxes. Even those who have to pay taxes are able to avoid taxes. Now, you live in the United States, I live in the United States, and we know how difficult it is to dodge the tax man in this country. Going against IRS is something unthinkable, and IRS can punish people, attach their properties and so on for any kind of delinquent behavior. I worked with Moin Qureshi when he was Prime Minister of Pakistan. I was his advisor, and we published two things. We published a list of Pakistani taxpayers, and we also published the amount of tax that they were paying. And that brought a certain amount of moral pressure on high-income people who were paying just pittance by way of taxes. So the government has to really make it very difficult to escape the tax net. Fear of God and fear of the government are only two things that combine to make people pay taxes. So if Imran can clean up the tax administration and bring in serious punishments for those who dodge the system, that would certainly help. And then exempting things like agriculture from taxes, not collecting enough tax from immovable property. I mean, these things have to be taken care of. And they are not too difficult to do. All you need is political will and honesty of purpose. Imran has the reputation of being a very honest guy, a person of high integrity. And just by being that, he will set an example, and that should help. But it's going to be hard, long labor before so many problems that have crept into the situation can be taken care of.
Mr. Burki, I cannot let you go today without asking you what do you think about the present civil-military tensions in Pakistan. Where do you think these matters are heading, or do you think they have already reached a point of no return?
I've been reflecting on this quite a lot. I've written about it. Also, my view is the following, that the Arab Spring, has brought a new factor into the political societies of all developing countries. In fact, developed countries also. What we saw in the United States by way of Occupy Wall Street movement and so on was one reflection of what happened in the Middle East. My view is that from now on, it is going to be extremely difficult for anybody to do anything which does not have the broad support of the people. That's why I think the army, which always walked in and took control of politics in Pakistan whenever there was a serious economic problem, is not likely to do that, because they know that the wrath of the street will come out and will have an effect. Imran's rise, I think, is also a reflection of this. People are very unhappy with the current leaders. They are disgusted with the amount of corruption and mismanagement and bad governance that they have, and they are now speaking out. Lahore meeting of Imran, I believe it's on the 30th of October or 31st of October, was an amazing meeting. I went to Pakistan after that. I wasn't there when he had that meeting, and people told me that it was a combination of a festival and a political meeting. Now he's going to have one in Karachi, and if that goes well, then I think he is generating a momentum which might result in his coming in and some cleansing of the system. But as I said before, these things take time, and in the case of Pakistan, things have gone bad for so long that it will take some time before they can be cleared up.
Thank you, Mr. Burki, for joining us today and discussing the economic patterns that PoliTact has observed.
Not at all. Nice talking to you.
In the next segment, we will be talking about the patterns and trends that we have observed in the area of defense and security.